So as my grandpa was continuing to age, he had congestive heart failure. He had aortic stenosis, so a narrowing of his aorta. So his cardiac output was had rapidly declined and was in shocking kind of low numbers. But he was otherwise a very physically capable. When I say otherwise, besides his heart failure, he was a physically strong person, quite a small person. As he got into his 90s, he weighed about 125 pounds, but was still very capable, walked every day, still worked in his garden in ways that he could. And he was also the primary caregiver for my grandmother, whose own health was really declining, and her physical needs. She was not as physically capable as he was. We had home support, and my family really helped to rally and help look after her too. But they were in their own home, and it was very much his, as he saw it, his duty. And when I look back at my grandpa, I think he was really in some ways plagued by his sense of duty, and his perfectionist thinking, his catastrophizing, his worrying, his guilt, and this need to, work himself to the bone, even though there was other help around and there were other options and alternatives. I think he carried that a lot. And when I think about,
sounds familiar, right?
It sounds very familiar. When I think about how he sort of would have moved through his day, compared to or similarly to when he was a younger man as a family doctor with a whole community to look after, I think he had probably some of those same feelings of either feeling overwhelmed by the day or feeling like a little bit of a high or a buzz was going to help him kind of get through that and could elevate him. And in his 90s was very, very high functioning and coped with some of those mental health characteristics that you and I are so familiar with. He also certainly had traits of being obsessive compulsive, of really being, when I say fastidious over certain things, to the point of worry, to the point of obsession, where he could really fixate on certain things being perfect, or things that he was doing were not good enough and not perfect. So when I look at those aspects of his personality that I think became heightened as he aged, and knowing that he had this syrup in his cupboard that if the need struck him, or if that urge struck him, that he would go to, only then in his old age, it wouldn't have been as open as it was probably in his younger years. It would have been something that he did more quietly, I would expect. I know, because it wasn't until very late in his life that we kind of clued in, like, oh, this is what's happening.
Yeah. And it's a shame that had to be the case there, or that he felt that had to be the case. I mean, when I have somebody come into the pharmacy and I see they're elderly, and if I look and, if you're retired, I mean, obviously I automatically have some extra respect for you. You kept it together. You made it to that point. That's an accomplishment. Anybody over 70, I think you should be given some sort of an award. You've battled this long, and you're still standing. Especially if you got a good attitude, those people impress me. But when you get past 80, past 90, it should be basically across the board, whatever the hell that person wants to do, as long as it's not hurting anyone, you let them do it, because that person deserves, they've spent the time to at least have that much autonomy. And I mean, obviously you've got problems if giving a total autonomy to people who are in cognitive decline. But in your grandpa's case, where it sounds like he was very much under control of his own affairs.
Absolutely.
Why in the hell? Give me one good reason why that guy shouldn't be able to have some Nova His stacks.
Sure,
Really?
I can't. Other than the other than that I'm about to say isn't a reason to say no to that, but it was starting to interfere with his own health, and I think for him his own physical constitution was changing, and but that sort of tape that plays in our head doesn't change.
Right.
And
maybe it amplifies.
So I guess with that comes just increased risk. But we've talked about this many times, and I've talked about it many times, that I really believe that people have the right to live at risk. And whether you're a person in your 90s living in your own home, substance free, you are still living at some degree of risk. Whether you are an unhoused person, whether you whatever your limitation may be, there's risk associated with it, and you're allowed to assume that. So, but for him, that behavior did certainly put him at higher risk. So he was already starting to have some episodes of fainting and of like conscious and partially conscious collapse, where he would be out walking and it would be too strenuous for him, and he collapsed a couple of times. And the ambulance was called a couple of times. He also had atrial fibrillation, so his heart rate would go sky high, and again his cardiac output would decline, and he would get into medical distress.
Yeah, congestive heart failure is horrible for. It really exacerbates any kind of cognitive issues as well, right?
Yeah. So there were a couple of times where the ambulances were called, and there were a couple of times when he did go into hospital. And he was very pragmatic and very realistic, and said, like, I don't want heroics. I want to be in my own home, period. There was a one time where he was cardioverted for his atrial fibrillation, but otherwise the treatment was very conservative. And he said, like, just get me back home. Mm-hmm. And so as he was sort of moving up in his 90s, it was not an uncommon thing for the ambulance to be called, and he would eventually decline service or decline care and sign off on it, or get one of us to. So that said, though, we would want to be with him. And so when the ambulance would be called, or when my grandma would call us with concern, and then we would call the ambulance, some of us or one of us would rush over there. So when he was about 94 years old, that's a estimate as best I can. I think it was about a year before he died. My grandma had called us and said that he was sort of sitting in a chair and was unresponsive. He was breathing, but his breathing was very slow and irregular. And what should she do? And my grandma, I think at this point, was 91 or 92. And so we had said, let's call the ambulance and get them over there, and we'll come. So my older sister and I got in the car and rushed over there, and it's about a 12-minute drive from Abbotsford to Mission, and we hustled over there and got there. And as is commonly the case, when ambulances aren't available, the firefighters come first, and they're usually in abundance, and they're usually, and I don't want to sound too critical of firefighters here, but they're usually sort of, one is doing the task and the others are circling. And any ER nurse that's listening will know that. And so when we arrived at their house, there were, I think, 5 is my best recollection of how many like young male firefighters were surrounding my grandpa. Mm-hmm. And they had an oxygen saturation probe on his finger, and they had oxygen in his nose, and they're all fussing all around him. And again, he weighs probably 120 pounds. He was just a tiny man at that point. Mm-hmm. And his consciousness was starting to kind of perk up a little bit with the oxygen. Mm-hmm. And he sees me through the part of the firefighters, and he says, Corey, come over. And he calls me over, and he was very hard of hearing, so I got very, very close to him. And he whispers in my ear, I just took a little bit of Novahistix.
Right.
And I had sort of that moment where it's like, oh shit, okay. Everything's okay here, folks. And okay, so what do you want to do? And he said, I'm fine, but I took some Novohistics. And again, this is, like I said, the risk of, like with anyone who isn't taking an opiate regularly, they have some time away from it, they go to take it, and this is when we are at greatest risk for overdose.
Mm-hmm.
When a relapse or a slip occurs, you take what you used to take, and it hits you much, much harder and very differently than what you were used to. And so when I think about my grandpa, this is not fentanyl, this is not heroin, but it was a syrup that he was used to taking and probably taking X amount of quantity of. Now you put that into a 94-year-old body with congestive heart failure and low cardiac output, and it's going to hit a little different, as they say.
Yeah. That's a important thing, that whether your body changes from losing weight or age, there's significant kind of pieces along the way, or significant markers along the way, that will change the way that drug is metabolized in your body. And I guess the other thing, and I've seen this before with people who are using pain medications as prescribed, but early on, when they weren't used to like if they've never taken an opiate before, I've seen people have trouble where they take, maybe Hydromorph or something that's fairly potent, and especially with elderly people, maybe they forget that they had already taken a dose. They take another dose. They're sitting there for a little while, and like, did I take it? They're getting more confused, and every time they get confused, they think they forgot to take their dose. I've seen at least one person they would have died that way. And it wasn't, it wouldn't be like your typical overdose, but I wonder that with your grandpa, when you're at that stage, your memory's already not working great. You're fatigued, your oxygen saturation is low. Maybe you took some, wandered around for a little bit and was like, I should take some Novohitic, go back, take some, that could happen too.
Sure. Or just like not having the insight that, like, two tablespoons is going to knock me on my ass, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the end of the story there, first of all, is that we sent the firefighters away. I think we signed a release document, and then we kind of got him comfortable until he perked back up again. But what fascinates me is thinking about sort of knowing now what, if I were him, and knowing some of the similarities in his personality and my personality and some of those traits, like what on that day was driving him, and what was his motivation? Was he feeling overwhelmed that day, or did he just want to get high that day? And I look back at him and think I'm more curious now than I was, and I think I understand him with a little bit of a different lens now than I did.
Certainly. Well, I can tell you with almost certainty that if by some, I don't know how long I'm going to last, but if I make it to my 90s or 80s or probably, I'd say 75-ish, I'm definitely going to start messing around with whatever I get my hands on, because I think you get to a point where, you got so many aches and pains, you've got, plus just I get bored sometimes, right? I'm a busy guy. I try and do all sorts of things to keep myself occupied, but I get bored. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like, when you're past that point where you're no longer looking ahead at, your future endeavors are not really, those prospects are not worth turning around in your mind very much. So you're just kind of sitting there around, existing, right? And yeah, you probably want to spice things up.
It may be that. And I know, and that's certainly an issue that gets talked about in groups and talked about in meetings with that I attend, that boredom is a driving factor.
Oh, huge.
Absolutely it is. And is is also a human condition.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess it's probably like everything else, where some people have a greater ability to self-soothe or entertain themselves. And I think self-soothing is more when you can handle a lot of stress, you've got problems, but you're still managing to cope with that. But that's to me is a different type of thing than I've got everything done, I'm ahead of it, everything's generally under control from my perspective. Now what? That kind of boredom where you're like, I'm kind of taken care of here and I've got extra time. That's the one that gets me, Yeah. It's so I guess, I don't know, what do you call that? Entertaining oneself?
I think that's something that is a common feeling. Yeah.